Yes? Can you... Okay. So thank you very much indeed for that keynote speech. Most interesting. And yes, we all do have a huge responsibility with all this data as to what is done with it. And we have to be very, very careful about that. And in this session, we're going to be looking at the ethical dilemmas that you're already facing and ones that you may have not thought of, or that ones that could be coming up in the future. Obviously, if we're trying to unleash the power from statistics, we also do risk opening up this Pandora's box of ethical problems. So how can people be certain that the data that official statistics offices have is secure? Should there be greater checks and balances to safeguard the privacy of citizens' data held in the official statistics offices? How can official statistics agencies become even more resilient to politicians? We heard a bit about this yesterday. What do you do if you produce the numbers and your president refuses to publish them? So to discuss these difficult problems and more, I'm joined on stage by three expert panelists. First, we have Margo Anderson, who is a distinguished professor of history and urban studies at the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee in the United States. She specializes in American social, urban, and women's history, and she's particularly interested in the development of statistical data systems, particularly the American census. When considering the public management of big data today, she believes we can learn lessons from what has been described as one of the most shameful instances of the government misusing its own data, an infamous case that goes back more than 70 years ago, which has still got lessons for us today. Then we have Corinna Schulze, who is Director of the EU Government Relations Digital Government at enterprise application software company SAP, or SAP, yeah. She's responsible for public policy matters related to the digital single market, among other things. And she's a expert in data protection, privacy, law enforcement, and cybersecurity. That's quite a portfolio there. Corinna also participates in the Big Data Value Association, which is an industry-led body working on the European Commission, with the European Commission, on the implementation of the Big Data Value Public-Private Partnership. And before she joined SAP, she spent more than 10 years working at IBM. And our final panelist is Pernille Tranberg, who is an independent advisor in data ethics for companies, authorities, and organizations. That work includes advice on handling personal data ethically and also developing ethical strategies or reviews. And she also helps individuals as well, so not just companies, to protect their data and perform digital self-defense, something that I think it's a skill we all need in these days, really. Very interesting. She's written several books, including the latest Data Ethics, The New Competitive Advantage, which was published in English as well last year. So please give our panelists a warm welcome. Like yesterday, we're going to be dividing our discussions into various topics, and there is going to be opportunity for you to do some live polls again. We're interested to get the temperature of the room and also the thoughts of people who are watching on the web as well. And we invite you to send in questions to Twitter using the hashtag #PowerFromStatistics. And what we'll do is we'll also have a bit more opportunity for questions from the floor today. So after each topic, I'll be opening up the floor for questions while we're waiting for the results of the poll. So hopefully we'll have lots of interaction with you all today. So the first topic we're going to talk about, if we're talking about ethical dilemmas and statistics, in a way what we need to start with is the type of information that we collect and disseminate. That's the starting point, really. And of course, different countries have got different traditions regarding the way they collect and hold and disseminate the figures. And having information on certain sensitive attributes, for example, ethnicity, can be used, for example, to help, for good, to help disadvantaged people. But on the other hand, those figures can also be used as an abuse, for example, to stigmatize a certain group. And breach of statistical confidentiality can have incredibly disturbing and far-reaching consequences, as happened at the American Census Bureau in the 1940s. So in this topic, we're going to be asking what are the risks and the opportunities to consider before systematically collecting and distributing information on sensitive attributes. And to introduce us to this topic, we're going to hear from Margo Anderson from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee. You have your microphone.
This is on? Okay, thank you very much. This has been a really enlightening experience for me. I hope to be able to contribute a little bit to the general discussions here from the world on the other side of the pond, if you will. I've been asked to talk about a piece of my work on particularly the evacuation and incarceration of about 100,000 Americans of Japanese ancestry during the Second World War. Okay, I will try to embed that in the history of both the American state and the what I would call the federal statistical system. In other words, how it came to be that this took place. This is a piece of work I do. I work on both the general political history of census taking, in other words, going all the way back to the constitutional era of the 18th century, all the way up to the present, debates about undercounting and the new digital world and the politics, the very contemporary politics. But today I'm going to talk a little bit about the emergence of confidentiality and its, and in some sense the failure of what were then the provisions for confidentiality, data protection, and the claim that there would be no harm for participating in the statistical system. Okay, so what happened in about February of 1942 is that the United States Army, in conjunction with officials from a number of federal agencies, but most notably for our purposes here, the Federal Census Bureau, developed a methodology to go around the 3 West Coast states, California, Oregon, and Washington, using the recently available data from the 1940 census to identify small areas to which the Army and local officials could be deployed to quite publicly, round up those folks and put them in what were then called concentration camps, mostly for the duration of the war. The argument was that this was a method to protect against potential sabotage in the wake of the Pearl Harbor attacks, which had taken place 3 months earlier. This was, notice this is all before the digital age. This is all pen and paper thing. So it's this is possible to do in the old-fashioned sense, and there are unfortunate parallels to the Nazi-era roundups in Europe, in the Netherlands, in Norway, Germany itself, and so forth. So this is a common problem of the era. Now, what happened was that that in the previous 40 years, the statistical system had, in fact, begun to promulgate and enforce through law confidentiality measures that were written to say that statistical information at the micro level could not be used for taxation, investigation, or regulation. Obviously, to do this roundup, one had to either finesse or waive those rules. In fact, the United States Congress passed a law at this point to repeal those confidentiality provisions that were put in law in the 20s. So what we have is a political consensus that this was necessary to do at the time, which was upheld by the United States Supreme Court decisions, and wasn't really rethought until 40 years later when a political coalition of civil rights advocates, the Japanese American community and its descendants, went back and asked for the U.S. Congress to look at this issue again, and they did, and in fact, of course, paid reparations to the survivors and claimed that they never should have done it, that there was no military necessity to do this. Now, there's lots of bells and whistles that I can talk about in detail, but probably I should stop there to just give you a sense of the deep sort of empirical reality that one needs to sort of think about as one discusses particularly the problems that occur to the statistical system when it's under very, very severe political pressure, which was the case in those early months of World War II.
Just out of interest, you all work in the field, so maybe you've heard that. Can you just put up your hand, anyone who's heard of this case or knew about this? Okay, quite a few people, but quite a few people who didn't. I mean, I found it very revealing when we were talking about it. I don't know what your reaction to this thing is. You've got your microphones there if you want to.
I think my first reaction would be maybe even the shock to which extent you can do this with pen and paper. Because as you said, my background is in software, so I know what you can do with big data technologies. But it's true also, being German, I know what happened in Germany, and it's really the finesse, as you said, that can be used with pen and paper. Also putting different records together. I know from the Nazi regime that they looked at all different records and brought them together. So essentially, what they did at the time already was profiling. So for me, I think the lesson learned is really that with technology now we have a new phenomena, we have new dimensions, we can do this on a much bigger scale, much faster, but it happened before already. So this notion of profiling, bringing records together, identifying people and pursuing them, unfortunately, is already very old. And that was my initial reaction.
Yeah.
Well, my reaction is it's happening today. All over. I don't know if there's anybody from the Statistical Agency of Turkey. Anybody here? Because I know how the Turkish government uses Facebook data. I don't know if they abuse the statistical data, but they use Facebook data to identify people going to demonstrations. And then they stop demonstrations. They have millions of fake accounts on Facebook, so they can change the sentiment around, for example, a protest singer, and they can then cancel that concert. And everybody going to that concert, putting that on Facebook, they can go after them as well. So it's just used, even without using the official valid statistical data, they just use Facebook.
Okay, this is all going in a very sort of negative direction, I must say. Margo, from your experience, there are things, with this sort of huge amount of data that we've also got going out there, what do you think? For example, there could be things like confidential data centers. Do you think that something like that could be a help?
Well, what's interesting about the Japanese case, on the one hand, is when you look at it hard, like we're doing here, it's very hard to defend. Once you get past the panic that overtook the country of this fear of sabotage in the early months of World War II, the good sign is that it's never happened again. And it hasn't happened again, at least from the federal statistical system. Congress reinstated the confidentiality provisions of the federal statistical system at the end of World War II. They repealed what was called the Second War Powers Act. It was allowed to expire. And believe me, I've looked, and my collaborators have looked to see if we can find evidence of this kind of activity, at least from the federal government side, and it doesn't it did not happen again. And in fact, in the 1960s, when there was an initial proposal to build a kind of centralized, at that point, computerized data center, Congress stopped it on the grounds that they didn't have sufficient privacy and confidentiality protections in place at that time. So there's a sensitivity that developed afterwards. Right. So the result is that the ultimate irony in the United States is that it is the minority and ethnic and immigrant communities that demand the detailed data on their communities. We are now in a debate right now in the United States over whether to put a question on the 2020 census or category called MENA, Middle East and North African. Right? Now, given the Trump administration's proposals for what we call a Muslim ban, these two provisions are running in opposite directions, and it's sparking a political debate. The result is that I've been arguing that it is up to the communities themselves and to a much more open and transparent process, including events like this, to take the sort of more esoteric and technical aspects of these matters and bring them much more into the public eye so that they can be discussed and that people can protect their data. Right? I think that that was not in place during the Second World War. I cannot find evidence that the Japanese American community, for example, on the West Coast, understood what the dangers that they were facing and tried to protest against it. I don't think that would ever happen today. I think, in fact, almost any community, and because of the coalitions that have developed among sensitive groups, that this would immediately come to public view in ways, and it did, by the way, after 9/11 in the U.S., when there were rumblings of similar kinds of possibilities, to stop it and so forth. I can talk about that in more detail.
What do you think, Pernille, about what can be done now? It's even worse because, as you say, we've got the data's out there and people are using it. I mean, what can be done about that? Is there something authorities can do? What official statistics offices can do? What can we do?
Well, that's what I plan to say, that when we talk about profiling.
Yeah.
But I can also say, I think that if all the statistical agencies, they should get together and have ethical guidelines in the way that third parties can use their data. They probably have some, all of them probably have some ethical guidelines, but maybe you can even do something together. I don't know if you have it, honestly. And then you need to have a report button so that if somebody abuses your data, you can report it to you. And even if you want to go further and if you want to go in front of all this and keep the trust to your data, you could also have a kind of a team going out to visit third parties and actually check if they use the data in the way you want them to use the data, or if they did not abuse data, because that's happening today. So if you want to keep trust in your data, which I think is deadly important, you need to do something ahead of everybody else, where you actually become trusted. In the wake of GDPR, we will see the general privacy regulation from the EU. We will see privacy certification coming up. So just like the way we can certify organic food or environmental products, we will see certification of products and services who are living up to GDPR and even doing a little more. So with your trusted data, you really need to go ahead, and I think you can do that.
What about encryption? Can that help?
I'll get back to that, but I wanted to take it a level higher again, because you said, well, the first round was a bit negative, obviously. I wanted to take it to the positive use of the technology. I mean, there are many projects also around big data which are really for social good, and I would like to take an example from the US again on food deserts. I don't know if anybody has ever heard about food deserts. It's you have and you correct me if I'm wrong on that, but it's essentially parts of certain bigger cities where people don't have access to naturally non-processed food, like fruits, vegetables, and so on. You would just find fast food mainly in these areas, and that's obviously a phenomena which is very concerning, because the citizens of these parts of the city then obviously have health problems and so on. So tackling this problem is very crucial from different points of views. But when you come to think about it, the data you need, in order to address that problem, you need to have the underlying data. Otherwise, you can't. Who are the people living there? What are the boundaries? Where does it change from one part of the city to the next? So you need to really understand also what are the boundaries of this food desert. And when you think about it, the data that you collect there is very, very sensitive. So when you start such a project to try and help people and make sure that you bring the supermarkets back and you bring the fresh fruit and vegetables back, there is an underlying business case. People want to come back when they are sure that it's bought, because it doesn't make any sense to bring this kind of food when people are not going to buy it. So there are many, many different aspects you need to consider. But before you start such a project, you really need to understand what kind of data you need, how do you collect it, on which basis, and then how sensitive is it, and then at the end of the day, how are you going to protect it indeed? And I think, yes, encryption is part of the solution, can be part of the solution. But it's also very crucial to have, it's related to that, but you need to have access controls in place. Make sure that as little people as possible are accessing the data, because you also need to keep in mind that, yes, you have people who are working on such a project who need to have access, but it might also be data interesting for people who have, not necessarily the good of the project in mind. They want to get their hands on the data for totally different reasons. So they might even, being respectful of the law, yes or no, but they might just say, we don't care about what the law is, we want to get our hands on the data, and we just go into the system and grab it. So yes, encryption is certainly part of the debate that can help. As I said, very strict access controls, making sure that you have a system knowing who has been accessing or even processing the data. So I would really advocate, when you have these kind of projects, that you have a multidisciplinary team. That's always, we also see this within our company, that this is truly crucial, that you don't have the people with the technological skills in one corner and the ones who understand the law and our data protection experts in the other corner. It's really crucial to bring the different skills together in order to also assess and manage such a project. So this is, in addition to the technology, which is often neutral. I would, unless it's really military technology, I would argue that the technology as such is neutral. You need to understand what people are going to do with it, and hence, the technology to protect the data on the one hand side is very, very important. On the other side, you need the people with the skills to understand what it is about and how you put the technology in use. And with technology, I also mean like encryption, because obviously that's one way of protecting the data.
Margo, I know we talked a little bit about stewardship of data and the importance of that.
I didn't answer your question directly about the research data centers. I mean, the United States has put in place in the last decade or so what are called restricted access or research data centers, and it's an expanding network that started at universities and think tanks that essentially takes the researchers who do this kind of sensitive research, for example, projects following both using economic statistics data that come from employment records, matching with demographic records from population surveys to see family structure, mobility patterns, also very sensitive stuff. And so what they've done with this is essentially turn the researcher into a sworn employee of the statistical system, which requires, FBI background checks and lifetime commitment to the confidentiality of the data. And that seems to be expanding and working. In other words, it's bringing the people, a larger research community into the same network of protections and controls that, in fact, is pretty strong inside the statistical system. From to the point that outside researchers complain all the time that they can't get at what they're trying to, they can't. You're not giving me my data. The problem that I see right now is that the explosion of data collection and what we would call administrative byproducts of the digital world, the Facebooks, the Twitter, and so forth, or most recently the Equifax breach in the United States. Think of this: 143 million records have been hacked. That's half the U.S. population, right? It's clear that in the private sector, which did not participate, which didn't have the public political pressure on it, that these protections are very unevenly applied, right, and have been thought of primarily as technical problems rather than as ethical ones. And so that as the two systems begin to talk to each other and integrate, which I think is happening, that the ethical and discussions need to go both ways, if you will. And I think the public sector actually is, at least in the world that I know, is much further along in understanding and being concerned about these matters than I've seen so far in the rather brittle responses from CEOs of the corporations involved and so forth. So that's that's something where I think the statistical professionals can do a great deal to move the, to move protections and ethical practices forward.
Pernille, I wanted to ask you, you obviously work with companies and things. Do you see their work in this field as brittle, as Margo said?
I see a difference in the way that public data is not as well protected as private data. But I have a lot of more trust in the private sector when it comes to privacy, because I'm seeing big companies seeing that they want to differentiate from Facebook, the Facebooks and the Googles. Apple is actually one who is going forward with it. There are lots of bad things to say about Apple not paying taxes and stuff, but when it comes to privacy and giving you control over your own data, they are really going forward in this movement. We're also seeing a lot of other companies doing the same. I'm constantly promoting alternatives. Just one example is TomTom, a Dutch company who has the GPS and fitness trackers and smartwatches. And that's what I would buy anytime as opposed to the Fitbit of the US, because they have very, very clear data policies. Even a 12-year-old understand what they do and don't do with data. And they have what they call zero knowledge processing, so they auto delete all location data after 24 hours, which is brilliant. Don't keep the data if you don't need it anymore and stuff like that. So I have like 50 examples of private companies trying to go forward. That's what I say, data ethics is the new green.
And it's very interesting. So, I mean, you actually think the private sector is better than the public sector, Margo? I don't. Obviously, not in the.
Again, I think, in fact, this is exactly the conversation that we need to have, and whether there's been a scan of the private sector in the way that at least in my world, I mean, I can find documents that take every single agency in the federal statistical system, of which there are about 100 because it's a decentralized system, and tell you what their privacy and confidentiality and data stewardship policies are. I don't know if there is a public record of that yet for corporations and so forth. Because people are opting into social media, we are contracting into this world, whether we know it or, whether we've read all the fine print or not. I just think it's a new frontier of discussion. If I look back historically, this was exactly the discussion that took place, interestingly, initially in economic statistics, which were the ones that aroused the concern of the user first. And trade associations sort of stepped up and worked out with, in this point, the federal government, exactly how they would, what could go where. There were people in the federal government that wanted to take the manufacturing census data, for example, and give it to the Interstate Commerce Commission so that you could prosecute trade violations, right? And that was a contested issue for about a half century, including the Supreme Court saying, of course, the statistical system should give the enforcement agencies for antitrust that information. Congress, so the court decided in 62, in 63, Congress came back and rewrote the statute to say, no, that's not what we meant. So it's that kind of back and forth that I think in this new digital world is starting, and agencies and organizations like we have here are doing it, but I don't think we're there yet. Right.
Corinna, are you having the discussion, this type of discussion in that group that you're working on with the European Commission?
You mean the exchange?
Well, the exchange on the privacy and just exactly what we're...
I mean, we have it in all different dimensions, and it's interesting to see where, the data protection privacy debate is popping up, and also linked, obviously, to ethical questions a lot. So for the companies and how they can be sort of accountable about what they do about data protection and privacy, what you mentioned, I mean, first of all, there might be a slightly difference between business to business companies and business to consumer companies. We are a software company, we are a business to business company. For us, it is absolutely crucial that we don't lose data left, right, and center. We'd be out of business in no time if we would be losing customer data. So for us, the level of data security as such must be very high per definition. Otherwise, we wouldn't have a business case. So
and again, we have heard all these other companies that I'm sure said exactly the same, and yet they've suffered breaches. So
yeah,
assurances are good, but sometimes reality is different.
Yeah, but I think most of the technology companies have per necessity, have the highest possible level in data security. But having said that, data security and cyber security is, it's a different thing, right? It's different from data protection. I would like to point that out. Obviously, again, when you take data security, that's the technical level, to what, and it depends again on how sensitive the data is. If you have data of rare plants, for some researchers, this might be very important. You want to protect it.
Privacy,
but there is no privacy concern, right? So it always depends that you normally match the level of data security with the sensitivity of the data. But it could also be, I mean, if it's a nuclear plant, that's obviously again a different story. It might not be a privacy concern, but is obviously a security concern. But I think obviously that normally the technology companies per definition can come to a very, very high level. This is also why I think it's so important that we work together on research projects as well, to really see, also with the public sector, to see what is really needed and have the exchange there from an ethical point of view, but also to understand what is technically possible, really, to really, again, coming back to the encryption debate, what can you do with encryption? What can you do with technologies just like blockchain? And there we need to have a debate about, so what is it that the technology can provide, but then at the end of the day, what is it that you want to do from a political point of view as well? And you know, again, coming back to the Facebook example, certainly Facebook was never designed to give, you know, dictatorships the possibility to monitor people. It was you know, designed for a totally different purpose in the beginning. But we need to.
We human beings are very inventive and we're very clever, and something that can be very innocent can then turn into something incredibly dangerous very quickly, actually. Very quickly.
So this is why, I mean, I wouldn't say that we should stop innovation, absolutely not, but to have it, you know, an underlying dialogue about where this can be heading to is very important. And yes, we do have this in the different fora that we discuss about it.
Okay, thank you. Well, I'm going to stop this part of the debate here, and we're going to have the first poll question of the day. So smartphones at the ready, please. Those of you who are also watching online, you can vote as well. And the question that we're asking is statistical confidentiality still justified in the world of tomorrow? Quite it. And the various answers that you can choose from are yes, society will change, but the principles will still apply. Yes, but only for individuals. Yes, but only for enterprises. No, everything is likely to be already in the public domain anyway. And no, for other reasons. And if you can't see the question, remember you need to do refresh. While you are considering your responses, perhaps they're going to be very quick for you to decide, but anyway, we're going to have some questions from the floor. So please put up your hand, anyone who'd like to talk about this particular issue. There's a gentleman here. Now, yes, yes. Hang on, there's a microphone coming to you. And there's a lady at the back, if we could give her the microphone, we'll come to her in a minute.
Yes, do you hear me?
Hang on. I think he's gone back to the desk to switch on the sound. I think he'll be there in a minute.
No.
Okay.
No, it's okay. Yes, my name is Thomas Ljungqvist from the European Commission, DG Just, financial crime, and we deal in our unit with anti-money laundering. So I have a question mainly for Corinna Schulze, I think. So we have now a task force for financial technology in the Commission, and there are discussions everywhere about this topic. Well, financial technology can be used to speed up and enhance payments between financial institutions. And one type of financial technology is the distributed ledger technology, and a subgroup of this is the blockchain, which you talked about. Now, these blockchains can be fed with different information, payments, who paid and the amount and so forth, a lot of information. And as far as I have understood, these interlinked blocks are immutable. So it means that they cannot be changed. I've heard that there are some ideas how encryption could resolve this problem with confidentiality, but it's not quite clear yet. So,
could I we do have types.
Short. I come to the actual question now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Also, because just for your information, we're going to talk about new technology in a moment. We're going to talk specifically about blockchain, but about remote sensing, all these things
can
as
I
well.
just ask the question?
Please do.
So I wondered if you could comment on what you think about if this technology is compliant with the European rules on data protection. We have the General Data Protection Regulation soon. I think about the right to be forgotten, data retention periods, and the right to rectification.
Okay,
Yeah,
thank you. Well, could we answer that in a second? I'll get the other question, and then we'll answer that.
Hello, my name is Corinna Buriana from the EU Open Data Portal, the Publications Office maintains. My question is more related to, you talked a lot about the private sector data and how to keep it, ethically protected and secured, etc. But don't you think there is also an ethical obligation to use the data to make sure that you use it correctly and safely and securely, but that there is an ethical obligation also to make it useful for the public good? And perhaps to do that, first we need to talk about the standards, because we talk a lot about what should and shouldn't be, but if we have common standards of security, of anonymization, all of these aspects, we basically need to lay the foundation so that we don't have to have those ethical dilemmas. So what do you think about that?
Thank you very much indeed. So, Corinna, please don't steal the thunder too much of our discussions on technology, but please answer the question about technology, and then we'll...
Yeah, I mean, to be very honest, I'm not an expert necessarily on blockchain technology as such, and I don't want to dive too deeply into that. But my understanding is indeed that once the data is in the blockchain, then it's not possible to change it, and that's the beauty of the system, actually. But again, it's the debate we need to have, to sort of anticipate what are the stumbling blocks, indeed. But I mean, the purpose is that you can't modify it, and unless somebody decrypts the system, it should not be modified. But there are a lot of questions, obviously, coming up in that context. And to the other question, and I know we also have the section on open data, and to what extent should stakeholders provide data, or can provide data that they have in their custody, if you will. Again, as private stakeholders, we have to abide by the law. And if the data protection legislation has clear rules on under which conditions you can provide access to a third party when it comes to personal data, then we have to play by these rules. I mean, these are the boundaries, and it'll be very difficult to tell a company or another stakeholder. Just to say that when it comes to the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation, it's not only companies who are within scope, but also other, can be an NGO even, who have to abide by these rules. So we cannot just happily hand over data that is personal to a third party. So we have to really already see what are the boundaries of the law. And this is also the link to the earlier question, you know, that we that whenever also we come up with a new piece of legislation, or when we have these debates about what can be used and what is the ethical dimension, for us, first of all, the existing legislation this is the framework in which we operate. These are our boundaries. We cannot just say, okay, we ignore it. I mean, they're very, you know, can be very severe consequences for us if we just say, oh, but we think, you know, this is good use and we should put the data to this kind of use. And then at the end of the day, we're confronted with fines or obviously, you know, the consequences that you have in the law.
Would you like to add anything from what we've heard?
Yeah, because there's a really interesting related question on Twitter saying it's from Fernando Rice, asking many news on personal data breaches in private companies, not on official statistics. Why lack of trust? And then I need to correct something, because when I talk of lack of trust, it's definitely not from the statistical agencies, because I haven't heard of any examples of breaches or abuse of data directly from agencies. I'm talking more about how good governments are to secure data. So that's data security, just to make that. Okay. And I'm not saying, I think there are more private companies out there abusing data than being ethical with data. I'm just seeing a new trend. Being ethical with data is definitely coming from the private sector. All my examples in my book are from the private sector, and I'm really, really looking for examples from of the States. So if you have any really good examples, also from statistical agencies, I'll definitely want it.
Okay, thank you. Margo, have you got anything to add? No? Okay. Right, well, I'm now going to close the voting, and we're going to have a look at the results. Francesca, thank you. Okay, so we are all very keen on, yes, society will change, but the principles will still apply. That's 82%, is that? Interesting though, we've got 11%, everything is likely to be in the public domain anyway. Do we think that's the case, panelists, that everything's going to be in the public domain anyway? No.
Oh, definitely not.
No.
I mean, there will be a lot of kind of reality stars out there who want to be totally transparent. But I'm sure that we'll see the opposite of what we're seeing today. The younger generation will find out that they are becoming too vulnerable if they are too transparent. In fact, we'll see a lot of tools and a lot of things going on where you will disguise yourself, you will behave like a spy, and you will actually lie about your data. 1 out of 3 Europeans are lying about their data anyway today in the public sphere because they want to protect themselves.
And in fact, I read a very interesting article about the people, the pioneers in Silicon Valley, whose children are now going to schools where they have no computers, no tablets, they're not allowed to have any technology, no smartphones, because they're suddenly realizing the consequences.
To learn to be humans.
Okay, thank you. Well, we're now going to move on to the next bit, which we've already touched on. Again, all these subjects are very, very interlinked, which is about profiling. Pernille, I think if you could start us off with that, I think that this is a very interesting topic.
Yeah, about profiling. Well, we are already today seeing statistical data being abused by private parties. One example, I want a list of all neighbors in Denmark who live next to a cancer patient. That's what you can get by the help of statistical data. So I'm very sure that you are not abusing the data, but your data is being abused in many ways. So it's all about making sure that third parties will use your data in a proper way. And I have one example of a really interesting company in Denmark called Geomatics, who work with statistical data, and they help companies enrich their data to do more profiling with your data. And they have very high ethical standards. So it's all a question about how low will you go in numbers when you're able to identify people. And they have some really, really interesting rules, I think, which some of you definitely apply to as well. They say that if you want to use data which is non-sensitive, you have to have at least 5 families in a cluster. Then it's very, very hard to identify people. If you have sensitive data, like health data or political party whom you voted, then you need 400 people in a cluster. On top of that, you have to make sure that if it's diabetes, for example, you need 3 women, at least 3 women who have diabetes, not 1 man and 2 women, because then you can identify. And that's what they work with in Geomatic. But they say that most of their competitors don't care about this. They just use data and they can identify data, because that's what a lot of companies, they are trying to do, like Facebook, and identify people, because that's more money. So what I believe is that when you are selling or giving away your data for private companies to enrich their data with your data, to do profiling, you need to set the standards, I believe, and have very, very clear ethical guidelines on how can these data be used. And as I said before, you could even apply another layer on that, where you have kind of people going out, third-party checkers going out to check with the private companies, are they actually using your data in the way that they have promised in your terms of conditions, in your data ethical terms of conditions. That's a way you can keep your trust. And we'll just see more and more profiling. So if you want the confidentiality, as you just voted for, you really, really need to do more than just being trusted yourself. We all trust you, but we also want to trust you in the future.
And in fact, there was something yesterday that didn't come up that I think I would like to mention. And when we're talking about trusting you, we're seeing a lot of fake websites coming up now. And I know that one of the, I can't remember who it was, or maybe it's coming up later, but someone sort of said that Eurostat should be very careful that someone doesn't invent a fake website that looks just like Eurostat, but that has different statistics on it. So when you're thinking about confidentiality and being careful, this is also another level of, let's say, awareness that you have to be careful about. That you're keeping an eye on those type of things, and you're making sure that the public is, monitoring these situations. I don't know. It's a very sensitive subject. Margo, you're writing lots of notes. I don't know whether this is for. Well, what do you think about profiling?
Again,
Microphone.
I think I know this in a different context. There's the marketing context, which is the one that you're using. There's also the and there has been again in the U.S. a real debate about sort of racial profiling, say by the police to pull over drivers. There's a phrase called "driving while black." And which, because it's become an abuse, again, this isn't statistics, it's just that embedded in the culture are these notions of how certain kinds of groups of people behave, and therefore actions by companies or government agencies on the basis of that. That's been subject to lawsuits to stop it and prevent it. I don't know if there's any law that prevents an abuse of data by the private sector, for example. So let me stop there.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah, already today. I mean, I also wanted to mention that yes, we are waiting for the general data protection regulation, but we already have a directive today. So it's not. I mean, there are already very strict data protection and privacy rules in Europe today, and this discussion about profiling and decisions based on automated means. I mean, there's also a slight difference there. I mean, often profiling is in the upfront to that decision. First, you do profiling, which can also be done obviously by automated means. But we also said before, as we explained, you can also do profiling based on pen and paper. But it's there's a slight difference, and where the focus is in the European law is really to make sure that when you come to a decision which is just based on automated means, that you need to, when it can have considerable consequences for the individual, you need to have human intervention. And that is actually, I think, a safeguard which is very, very important, and which already, I mean, again, it's a directive that we have, and it's been implemented differently in other member states. But this notion of having a human intervention when it comes to decisions which were just made by automated means, that is really, really important. And I think, to be honest, when it comes to that, I think at least the cases which are coming to the surface, we do have the safeguards in place there, to say that if you can, if you're looking for a loan and you want to take a credit, that the banks cannot just access your data, analyze yourself, and then have a machine taking that decision. I think the safeguards are in place. Again, the technology is such, from my perspective, is neutral, and also, you can have a lot of positive profiling again, and we.
Okay, give me examples of positive profiling, please.
For example, a very everyday today case, in order to unearth credit card fraud, right? When your credit card was used in a totally different context out of where you usually use it, this is only for the bank, or not the bank, the service behind the credit card. I don't want to mention any companies now, but they can only find this out because they compare patterns, and these patterns are actually profiling. I would, that you understand, usually you have this kind of use, and all of a sudden your credit card is being used at every petrol station from here to I don't know, up to the English Channel or whatever, that there is an understanding of this, there is something wrong. But if you don't have the comparison and the pattern, you cannot identify that there's something wrong. So for me, there are a lot of cases where you can say profiling as such is helpful to come up to a certain conclusion. But again, as I said before, when it comes to a considerable impact on an individual, you have to get the checks and balances in place. But it's, as such, upfront, it's neutral.
Well, I agree there are lots of good examples of profiling, like the one you gave, but also even Amazon is pretty good at profiling the book you read, and this and that. And when you do profiling, and it works, it's usually the data you have gotten directly from a person. It's not the data you get from third parties, from tracking people around the web. But the bad examples are manifold, and being a very conscious consumer today, you realize that you are being economically and politically manipulated. Really, really bad today. And the way people wake up usually is when they find out that they are paying too high a price for something because they don't know how to use privacy tools. They don't know how to pretend that they are in Germany instead of Denmark, and I get 25% lower prices on hotels in Japan, And that's when we realize we are being economically manipulated in the profiling. And we have seen in the US and Brexit that we are also being politically manipulated. And that's a negative part of profiling. So if you do profiling and use statistical data, which I'm sure most of the companies are using, you really need to be careful and make sure that the profiling is done on data that the data subject knows how you got that data and you actually gave that data away. So the best data you get is from the person directly.
can quickly respond to that because I mentioned, legal frameworks before. I mean, what you just described strikes me as a very unfair commercial practice.
It's not illegal.
It's boundary. Yeah? So I think what is also very important when you look at new technologies, that we always keep in mind what is the acquis in terms of legal framework that we have today. So as we described at the very beginning, a lot of the things are not new, but they're put in a new way of use via technology. So I think this is very, very important also to make sure that the lessons we learned already are that we carry this forward, but also sort of analyze it in the framework that we have today, and not just say, oh, we need now something new, also from a legal perspective, but really always reconsider what is it that we already have in place where we could, sort of say defend, or the individual can really make sure that it's the acquis is respected that's already out there. But I find this case that you mentioned, that in the Silicon Valley parents are now making sure that their children have no sort of devices accessible at school. That's an interesting trend. Yeah. And I think to educate the users, that is very, very important as
and
well.
Exactly, I was going to say that's one thing that we're all talking about, the handing over data, and yet no one's talking about telling people what they're doing. Because a lot of people, we all just sort of say, yes, I agree, you never read all the stuff. I mean, at the moment I'm getting bombarded by Google saying, we've changed our privacy policy, please have a look. And and I could go and do it, but I know that most people don't. And it's really, we really need to do something on that user level. Okay, I think at this point we're going to stop this part of the debate because I do want to get onto new technology, which is coming up next. So we're going to talk a little bit more sort of about blockchain, but about other technological things and how they could possibly be solutions to helping us with the confidentiality. But I do have another app question for you. And I'm going to open the voting now. So if you're in the app, you need to do your refresh. And the question, this will be interesting to see the answer to this one, is shall free access to privately held big data for official statistics be guaranteed by law? And the first answer is yes, the public good outweighs private interest in this area. Then we've got yes, but only in duly justified exceptional cases. No, this would distort the market. And no, for other reasons. So while you're thinking about that, we've got time for a couple of questions from the floor if anyone wants to talk about what we've just been talking about here on the profiling issue. I mean, I'm glad you did mention Facebook and Russian bots, and we haven't even touched any of that stuff yet. But anyone like to ask a question about profiling? No. Okay. Oh, sorry. Yes, it was so gently at the front, I didn't notice you. Sorry.
Hey, send up. Well, I was easing into it, my question. So it's really just more of an observation that I think that the debate that we're seeing is really between the politicians and the companies. So the companies, something bad happens, the politicians maybe get involved or maybe look the other way. The question about the data agencies, who are traditionally very good at protecting confidentiality, and so it's its own world of tightly controlled information, to the point where it can seem, and you work in that world, it can seem anachronistic compared to this other wild west of information freedom. So I guess I just want to ask again what role the data agencies can play in this debate that seems to be happening at a completely different level.
Okay. Who would like to answer that question?
I know we don't have data agency people on there.
Yeah. Or any thoughts? You don't have to answer the question. You can possibly any additional thoughts on that. I know that we don't have anyone really from the statistical agencies, but what more can be done to foster that discussion, really? Yeah. What do you think, Margo? I'm going to ask you. And no, but from your experience, you know, because you've seen them and what they do and what they've talked over history. So, is there any historical lesson we can learn?
I'm trying to envision how that conversation would work. In other words, who talks to whom first? I mean, we know what happens when something hits the media and the news and politicians get involved. I'm trying to envision beyond, in other words, whether there are professional associations and whether there's already sort of crosstalk taking place. So, for example, is this a conversation that would take place in the International Statistical Institute or in the American Statistical Association? Or what's the, in other words, how are the, and what are the, or, I mean, I don't know what the sort of professional associations of, you know, Google, Facebook, Apple, I mean, who goes to, who is responsible for talking about this, and how do you get the humans in the, as we are here, all in the same place for that conversation? So that.
I would certainly say I think Eurostat's doing this by the fact that we're here, and we also have people not just from the statistical community, but also from business, from other areas where we can all sit together. I mean, you know, this is not, of course, you know, it's great for our hosts, but everyone has been saying how interesting it is that they are not really involved in the statistics community, but they are here invited to give their, and this is perhaps a way of having these types of conversations, but yes, this is on a sort of more European level rather than the...
Can I give you an analogy here? One of the reasons that the abuses that led to the use of the data for the evacuation of the Japanese in World War II, it took a long time. It took, actually, the Commission on Wartime Relocation in the 1980s that looked at the issue never got to the statistical issue, because at that point the Census Bureau was still buttoned down on it, and actually the man who had overseen the process was still in the building. Right? So he's essentially obfuscated and shut down the conversation. 10 or 15 years later, when I and my collaborator, William Seltzer, who was a UN statistician, looked at it, it turned out that it took his statistical understanding of how official statistical agencies work and my understanding of how the politics of the census work to put the, you know, it took us about a year or two to put our heads together to figure out how to even start researching it and investigating it. And that's where I think a lot of this is, that there's still a lot of conversations that need to take place.
Pernille?
How many in here knows about this draft on ethical guidelines by Eurostat? How many of you knows about that? All of, put a hand up. Everybody knows about it? No, that's very few.
Most people from most people who've got their hands up are from Eurostat.
Yeah. Okay. So I think that's a brilliant thing, and I'm gonna go. It's 23 pages. I didn't know about it. I'll read every line, and I'll get back to you with some comments on it. But to have this, to make this work, I think you have to go in front, and you have to honestly show some of the bad cases. Show some of the cases where your stats have been abused. If you do that, it will get out in the press, and then you say, well, the alternative is our guidelines. We want it to be used in this and this and this way. That's the way we get it out. You have to have some of the horror stories, otherwise nobody will read about it.
Okay, I'm sure they'll consider that. I'm not quite sure that... Okay, right, I'm going to close the voting. And have we got the results of our poll? Can we find them? Okay. So... it's how much is that? 60%? 60% on yes, the public good outweighs private interest in this area. Okay, Corinna, get ready. You're going to have requests to hand over data. Okay, that's interesting. But only in duly justified exceptional cases. Okay. Yeah, but we've still got a combined 14% saying no. So yeah, interesting. Right, unless
If I
Yeah.
can comment.
Yes,
Are
of
we
course.
going to-
No, yes.
Are
well,
we going to...
should we
because
start
I'm
on
not
the
sure what this
technology?
time
Yes.
schedule is.
Yes. So if you could react, and then we'll talk a little bit about the technology.
Just to say the access again, you know, when it comes to the data that we would have, this is our customer data. I mean, I want to see that somebody knocks on our door and says, "You hand over the customer data." Sorry, this is not going to happen. And again, you know, the concern of when it's personal data, and the definition of what is personal data is pretty wide, you know. So you quickly come into the scope of the GDPR, and then you have clear boundaries when you can hand it over to third parties for all the reasons that we discussed already. And then obviously we haven't touched upon that. When it comes to demands of law enforcement, for example, you know, it's always yes, are companies happily handing over data to law enforcement or even, you know, to secret services? No, we want clear rules, and we want, you know, we want to be absolutely sure that, you know, when we have to hand over data, then it's, you know, based on within the legal framework that applies in that country. So when you look at this question, are you handing over data? Again, you have to consider all these facts in. You know, what data are we talking about, and what is the rest of the legal framework that kicks in by which companies are bound, you know, and is it really something that you want, you know? Again, you know, when we talk about access of law enforcement, we see the other part of the equation, right? That people are very concerned that companies are handing over data left, right, and center, which they usually don't, you know, and so it's a bit of, you know, it's
Where do you see that concern? Because, I mean, I don't think people are concerned if you have a warrant and you ask for data because you have a warrant, then of course you should give over data to law enforcement, right?
But it should be based on a warrant, indeed.
Yes.
You know, so
we agree on that. Of course, you give out your data to law enforcement when it's based on a warrant.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't think people are worried about that. They're worried about giving data without a warrant.
Yeah, but again, you know, it's not always clear. Also, when you operate around the globe, you know, what is the jurisdiction that applies? So, you know, on the one hand side, it sounds very interesting that you hand over data because you can do a lot of good with it, as we said, you know. And that comes back to the point of profiling. You know, often when you use data for public good, the underlying mechanism to extract the intelligence is profiling. But again, you know, we have to see what the boundaries are, and we are bound by law, and we have to respect the law, you know.
But the way the statistics agencies can get the data from private companies is very easy with GDPR, because as an end user, as a customer with you, I can always, from May next year, ask you to give you all my data. I want all my data in a format which I can use for your competitor. And then I can donate my data to statistical agencies. And that could be a way of getting data out of private companies, I believe. Ask the end user themselves to donate data.
Whoa. That's interesting. I'd never thought about donating data. Yeah. It's a big trend, is it? Okay, fine. I mean, we heard about user-collected data, but which is what, you know, sort of crowdsourcing. But donating data.
Donating data for science. A lot of people will like to do that.
Okay, interesting. And just talking about the technology side, you know, we've now got so many tools and apps that are collecting data that perhaps we don't even know. I mean, you know, the Fitbit watches, you know, the women using the ovulation calendar apps on their smartphones, and all that data is out there. Does technology create more of a problem for us, or does it also have some solutions for us on the data confidentiality and privacy?
I think again on what I said before, I would first of all like to say that technology as such for me is really neutral. It really depends on what you use it for and how you use it. As such, it's certainly, you know, it has helped us in many aspects. But now that people understand that it can often go both ways, it's critical to really have the dialogue, and as I said before, to bring different skill sets together. And that would be really my answer of, you know, trying to address the challenges that we see today, that we take, you know, the different experts out of their corners and not have an understanding of technology is going to solve all the problems, or technology in itself is a problem. No, it's really to put it into good use, but also have the other layers being considered, right? And the other skills and expertise coming in and sort of, you know, creating a whole framework around the technology. But again, for me, it's never either evil or just doing good. It's really how you put it to use, and this is why I think it's so critical that we have the dialogue.
Okay, we're coming to the end of the session. There is going to be questions from the audience, so if anyone has a question, please put up your hand and we'll get a mic. Okay, there's a lady here. Oh gosh, we've got lots of them, and they're all on this side. So 1, 2, 3, 4. And in the meantime, before we get you, I'm also going to just throw in another question into the mix from Michael Skaliotis. And he says on Twitter, NSIs today, National Statistic Info, have strong technical and organizational safeguards for privacy protection and ethics. What else is needed? Okay, so that's one question. We'll take the questions from the audience. So,
yes, thank you very much, Martine Durand from the OECD. I want to come back to this notion that you just mentioned, that technology is neutral. It's neither evil or good. Per se, and go a little bit deeper into this area, because suppose that you are you want to design policy. I'm more on the policy side now, and you want to use this data, and you know, in particular profile data, because you want to make sure you reach the right population, for instance, for your social policy, children or whatever. And you have a source of this data which is neither representative nor of the population really, and which perhaps is not curated, or is not been in a shape like you would do with surveys and so on, And on top of that, you put an algorithm, so technology, and so you mix that with intelligence, artificial intelligence, and you have an algorithm which then would give you, both because your data on which you are going to base your algorithm, and your algorithm itself, because I don't know who is going to program that algorithm, at the end of the day, it's going to give you a set of an information set on which you're going to base your policies, which can be completely flawed because you don't have the right base for the data. So the fact that technology, of course, someone is intervening to get the data, collect the data with some technology, and perhaps the algorithm is also designed by someone, so you could say technology is neutral. But I would argue that we are there at the boundary of neutral technology. I think technology in that case is not neutral, and at the end of the day you can get something very flawed and dangerous. So perhaps we're not discussing the same things.
This is a great example. Thank you very much for that. Actually, you know, when you think about the algorithm, the underlying algorithm, right, that somebody designed, you can explain without, you know, diving too deep into, you know, the code of the algorithm. You can describe what is this algorithm doing. You know, what is it that it is going to, from a mathematical point of view, going to process, right? But the fact that, and you very rightly pointed that out, if you use data that is flawed, that goes into the algorithm, put bias in, you get bias out. Absolutely. But that really underlies underlines a little bit the point that I made before, that you need different skill sets. It's not only the person who programmed that algorithm who counts. It is especially also the people, and it might be, and it's very likely, a totally different person who's going to feed in the data into the algorithm, right? And that person, yet again, has a different skill set. So this understanding of what kind of data, and it might be very well, you know, a person with a statistical background rather than a technician who's going to feed the data into the algorithm. But for me, again, you know, the algorithm as such is neutral, but the data that you feed in and the way then you use the algorithm, the ensemble, if you will, this is what makes the difference. But again, it is really the understanding also. You know, put flawed data in, you get a flawed result. Absolutely. So the quality of the data matters, but the person who ensures the quality of the data is very likely somebody totally different than the person who programmed the algorithm. So again, it goes back to my point of that you need another equipe, if you will, you know, to make sure that the results are good at the end of the day. And many questions play into that. And it's very, very, very important to take them into consideration indeed.
Okay, I do want to take the other questions that we had. Could you give the gentleman there? And we've got another two, but I'm going to take all these questions together, so could you put the microphone there and we'll put your hands up, the people who wanted to ask the questions. The gentleman over on the end of that row there. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Mark Hansen. I'm from Columbia University, and it's really weird to watch myself really big on the screen ask a question, but all right, I'm just going to look down. So first of all, just to get one thing out, I really strongly disagree with the idea that technology is neutral. Technology is never neutral. It's a product of human deliberation and human imagination and inherits all of the biases that humans have, whether that's an algorithm or a data construction system or whatever it is. It all has a human context, and so it all has it all inherits these biases. And in fact, you see this in the character when people talk about algorithms. There are particularly opaque algorithms, sort of to the point of being black boxes where you don't really know what's going on. You see moves on the part of DARPA, for example, to try to push for explainable AI, so maybe someone can see what's going on and evaluate what's going on there. But the whole area of algorithmic accountability is something that's really big in, I teach in a journalism school, it's really big in journalism at the moment, and so anyway, my question is not really about that. Sorry. My question, and you should have shut me off earlier, is when we were talking about new technologies, about profiling, about privacy and so on, how much data does a particular application, for example, need to do its work. We've talked about collaborations between the state, let's say, and private companies and statistical organizations maybe even, but I always thought that research universities have a special charge for creating novel systems that the marketplace simply won't create. Right, that it's the universities that can come up with.
And the question is?
And the question is, what is the role of universities in all of this? Because I haven't heard it, or maybe it's been implicitly present here. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. The gentleman who had the microphone here.
Hello, good morning. My name is Klaus Resch. I'm from the Commission in Luxembourg. Do I have to turn there or there? The topic here is how to deal with ethical dilemmas. Now, we got very interesting answers from the juristic point of view, from the historic point of view, from the technical point of view. But I got the feeling that we all assume that we know what ethical dilemmas are and when we are in an ethical dilemma. But how can we really tell that, for instance, public good outweighs privacy interest of individuals? Shouldn't we also include in this discussion people we think would be competent to talk about ethical principles in itself, like philosophers, artists, spiritual leaders?
Absolutely right. And even though I don't really have a say on this panel, I studied philosophy and I studied ethics, so I sort of have a bit, and I also studied journalism ethics as well. So perhaps, but you're quite right. That's interesting. I mean, do we need to have some of these other figures talking about the ethical dilemmas as well?
Yeah, I totally agree. And I have one good example of a French insurance company called AXA. They have an ethical panel flown in from all over the world 3 times a year. It's an insurance company, and they discuss concrete ethical dilemmas and how to handle them. And we need to do that on the go. So I think that's one answer. Of course we need that. But we need those philosophers also to understand tech and understand what it can do and not do of good and bads. And that's a problem with some philosophers. They simply say no to a lot of stuff, which is actually also really, really good. And about the role of universities, they should be role models, just as statistical agencies should be role models. And libraries, research, they should be role models in this world where you can make so much money on data. And when you are not interested in making money on data, I hope you're not. I'm also from Columbia University, actually, from the journalism school. Then you should be a role model and show everybody else what to do in the right way, like you do in journalism, for example. You can do that with data ethics as well and using, yeah.
And what about this thing about we've got the technical and organizational safeguards?
What else is needed?
Yeah, what else is
being
needed?
a role model. Show what you're doing of good with your data and showcase the bad examples. If your data is abused by somebody, you have to be open about it and say you will not accept this in the future. And maybe even have this, group of checkers who will go out and check that people or third parties are actually treating your data in the way you want them to treat it. So be role models and actually certify whatever the way people are using or third parties are using your data.
Thank you. And anything quick, short to add?
Yeah, I think this is the question of how a statistical agencies in particular can help their publics or their stakeholders become partners in sort of good data practices. That's where I was going before on essentially sharing responsibility and sort of saying, oh, it's like this is our job. No, it's everybody's job, and that we need to have this dialogue going on more broadly.
Anything to add, just quickly, on the role of universities and also the other things apart from the safeguards of protection and ethics?
Yeah, what I wanted to add on this one is from a company perspective, it's really also important to train your staff, your employees. This is something that shouldn't be forgotten, and it goes back to the point, that users are trained and understand what can happen to their data, but it's also from a company perspective to make sure that certain standards are really understood also by the wider community of employees as such, and the importance of like, for example, schemes like data protection and privacy.